Hello everyone, today let's talk about the ruler that measures a nation's wealth, GDP. GDP has become a very popular topic in the press, on the internet, on TV, in books, and everywhere else. So what exactly is GDP? Short for Gross Domestic Product, the value of all final goods and services produced in a country or region's economy in a given period, a quarter or a year. It not only reflects a country's economic performance, but also its national strength and wealth, and is often recognized as the best indicator of a country's economic situation. GDP is used to measure the economic output, or productive capacity, of a country or region. This is because this society is actually made up of income and expenditure, as well as inputs and outputs. Any economic action can be calculated using these two. So for a country or region, there should also be a question of inputs and outputs, how productive a country or region is, or to put it more simply, how much social wealth it creates, requires a single unit of measurement that can be compared from country to country and region to region. GDP is the unit of measurement. In other words, GDP is the ruler used to measure the social wealth of a country or region. What exactly does social wealth consist of? Generally speaking, the products produced by factories, the services provided by banks, the value created by schools, whatever people create through their own labor, whether tangible or intangible, is social wealth. Adding up all this social wealth is the gross domestic product, or GDP, which can be expressed simply as follows: total social wealth equals winter squash, plus pumpkin plus loofah plus shoes, plus clothes plus buns plus wine plus cigarettes. In order to make these unrelated products, in order to add up these unrelated products, the concept of value emerged in economics, i.e., how much a winter squash costs, how much a loofah costs, how much a dress costs, so that the total wealth of society can be calculated by expressing the value of each product in a uniform currency. The percentage increase in GDP that we often see or hear about is the increase in the total wealth of society from the previous year. Total social wealth in this context does not distinguish between ethnicity and nationality, meaning that it is included in GDP as long as it is created within the territory of a country, regardless of the color of the skin, and regardless of whether it is a domestic or a foreign company, as long as it is created at that time. For example, the profits made by Nokia's subsidiary in China will be counted as China's GDP, but not Finland's. The profits made by Lenovo's company in the US will be counted as US GDP, but not China's. Of course, there are several other modifiers to grasp about the concept of GDP. One is the concept of time, which is production within a certain period, a quarter or a year, which suggests that GDP is a concept of a time period, not a point in time. The second is the concept of production, which refers to the value of all products produced, excluding income from sales, which would otherwise be double counted. If, for example, 10 TVs were produced, there would be a representation of the value of the social wealth of 10 TVs, and you would not be credited with only a partial representation of the value because you did not sell them. Thirdly, final goods and services, which refers to the goods that are ultimately consumed and used by people, excluding intermediate goods, again to avoid double counting. Fourthly, value, which refers to GDP, was created after the Second World War, and has gradually been adopted by countries around the world. China has established a GDP accounting system since 1985, and a new national economic accounting system has been gradually established since 1992, with GDP becoming the core indicator, as a concentrated reflection of the results of social and economic activities of a country or region in a certain period of time. This indicator has now become an important basis for governments at all levels to formulate economic development plans and strategic objectives, and has become a household name and a barometer of the economy of concern to the world. Generally speaking, if a country's GDP grows significantly, it reflects a booming economy, an increase in national income, an increase in consumption power, and a rise in people's living standards. Conversely, if a country's GDP growth is negative, it shows that the country's economy is in recession, its spending power is reduced, and the standard of living of its people is lower. Sometimes, However, there is an anomaly, where GDP grows at a high rate, but the standard of living of the people does not increase. Why does such a strange phenomenon occur? This is because GDP represents the sum of the prices of end-use goods in society as a whole, while our standard of living depends on the sum of the value of use of end-use goods in society as a whole. The two are both interrelated and divergent from each other. For example, Mr. Elias' family ate 10 catties of pork per month 3 years ago at $45 per catty, which cost $45 in total. Last year, pork rose to 9 yuan a catty, and Mr. Elias' family still ate 10 catties a month, which cost 90 yuan. This year, pork has risen to $13 a catty, so Mr. Elias' family can no longer afford to eat 10 catties and can only eat 7 catties, which costs $91. Thus, Mr. Elias' family's GDP consumption has increased slightly despite a 30% drop in living standards. Mr. Elias' standard of living depends on how much meat he eats, while the GDP reflects how much money Mr. Lee spends on this meat. Sometimes Mr. Lee spends more money, indicating that he eats more meat, and sometimes he spends more money but eats less meat. As can be seen, while the positive effects of GDP are manifold, they also have their limitations. Specifically, the limitations of GDP are manifested in two ways. For one, GDP does not reflect the accurate picture of economic growth. For example, in one year there was a major flood, which caused great economic losses and hardship to many people in the affected areas. However, the GDP grew. Why is this? Because you need to invest a lot of manpower, material and financial resources in disaster relief, and a lot of materials have to be spent. So the GDP goes up and the GDP grows. In terms of our daily life, let's say we drive to work in the morning. If the drive is smooth, we get to our workplace quickly. If there is a car accident, the person has to be taken to the hospital for treatment and the car has to be taken to the car dealership for repair. So then the GDP goes up. The GDP increases. It would have been a bad thing to have a car accident, and it would not have produced any benefits. But in terms of GDP it grew. This kind of GDP growth is very inefficient in terms of wealth accumulation. Secondly, GDP does not reflect the cost of economic growth. For example, in some places, although the economic growth is relatively fast, the consumption of resources is very strong, causing a lot of environmental pollution. This is very uneconomical. Therefore, we should correctly understand the GDP of a country or region, neither ignore its important role, nor take it as the only indicator of measurement.